All right, hello once again. Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College. And as part of the Rankin Technical College Application and Website Development, or AWD 1111 Database-Driven Web Development course, I'm doing a series of video presentations. I have gone through and done several videos already from Mr. Flavio Copes and some of the PDFs he has under his The Value of Code website. I've also brought back some of the PowerPoint lectures or lectures on the PowerPoint that I did from our Muroc textbook back in the AWD 1000 class. But I'm also coming in here and going through Mr. Brad Traversy's Web Dev Guide, a complete guide to web development technologies, concepts, and career paths. And so far, I have gone through Chapter 1, which was on learning and planning, and he went through the different types of developers, talked about front end versus back end versus full stack. Now, next I'm going to go over Chapter 2, as you'd probably guess, and talk about some front end basics. I don't want to bore you with stuff you've already had, so a lot of it will be reviewed, but I'll try to keep it to a minimum. That said, you'll notice when we look in here that this chapter starts on page 37 and it goes for about 65 pages. So I may or may not be able to get this done in one lecture. Next, we'll go into Chapter 3, which is advanced front end. All right, and then we go into the back end stuff. So I'm going to jump right into where I am. Chapter 2, front end basics. And as he says here in this chapter, we will cover what it takes to get started and how to become a basic front end developer, including the basic software tools you need and HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And you've had a lot of this already. All right, yeah, of course you need a computer. Okay, personally, I agree with this. I didn't choose Google Chrome because Brad Traversy chose it. I chose it because after looking at Chrome and Firefox and Edge and Opera, who are the major players, it was the one that I liked the best, plus I like the developer tools. All right, and working with them. But as you can see, there are others as well. For the text editor, all right, basically I've pretty much chosen VS Code. There are other ones, but to me, they're a notch below. All right, Visual Code is more an integrated development environment than it is a text editor. A text editor just gives you, typically in my opinion, gives you basic copy and paste type of functionality. But an integrated development environment does things like have IntelliSense in it, have a lot of extensions you can add, etc. And that's what you get in VS Code. All right. As it says, it's a complete IDE. Now, I used to use Sublime Text. There's nothing wrong with it. All right. But again, like I said, to me, it's a notch below what you get with Visual Studio Code. That's my opinion. Not everybody's going to agree with it. Same with Atom. Vim I've never used. As he said, it's called an editor for nerds. It says it's the successor of VI, and I used to use VI, we're talking 40 some years ago. And it was a simple Unix-based text editor. You will use the terminal in this class. In fact, just to show you, if I come in here and I bring up, this is something we looked at before. This is that animate thing that we talked about. But notice if I go up here and I say view, that if I go down towards the bottom, there's terminal. Now this is a simple Windows terminal. All right. But there is a way to set it up. I don't remember offhand what it is. Let's see. We got here bash. Git bash. All right, so that is the one I'm using. So I'm using git bash. In other words, I'm using the same one that you get. Whoops, I don't know what happened there. I am using the same one that you get when if you were to right mouse click from here and choose git bash here. All right, the only difference is it's got a white background as opposed to a black background. Big deal. All right. Again, I'm recommending Git Bash. You can use any of these. So if you're more comfortable or more knowledgeable about a different terminal, You can use those. So we'll go over all this stuff as we get going. Now, design software, this is interesting. Figma, as it says, is extremely popular right now. I've actually started taking a Figma course because what you can use Figma for is it's very similar to what I have been using Balsamic wireframes for. It's more or less a wireframing type of tool. You hopefully have looked at Balsamic before. All right, I don't know if this is going to load up a project or not. It's not. But if I come through here and say that I want to, basically set up a web page, I can do it in here literally in a matter of minutes, which is kind of nice. Now, he mentions Adobe XD. I believe that I was going to say that that's not a free product. You can use Figma for free. You can use Sketch for free, but I believe Sketch runs only on a Mac platform. All right, Photoshop. Canva is another neat one. As they say, it's a great browser-based design tool that you can use for a lot of different things. All right. And as it says, there's many others as well. You might want to go and take a quick look at Canva if you get some time. And there's others, and he mentions some of the other ones. So, jumping in here, it says, now that we've gone over the tools, let's start talking about the technology. HTML and CSS are always the first things to learn. Yeah. Hypertext markup language, HTML, is the basic skeleton for a web page. Cascading style sheets, or CSS, is used for styling. Nothing new there. You know that HTML is tag-based. You know, because we've talked about this, that with the advent of HTML5, one of the things that came with HTML5 was the idea of using semantic tags. All right, so they're tags rather than using divs for everything that may make sense to the developer, but internally to the system may not mean much of anything. And now you've got something that looks like this. You've got header tags, footer tags, nav tags, section tags, a main tag, article tags, aside tags. You may not have all of these in your document, or you might. So here's an example. All right. There's a lot of different ways that this can be done. We've talked about this a little bit in the past. We've also talked about the meta tags. Does he show them here? Yeah, here's a couple of them. Now, these are the ones I added the description, but notice he's got the keyword as well. Meta tags, as it says there, meta is data about data. It says you don't have to be a master at SEO, which is search engine optimization. All right, you get some of the tags are added for you when you start your project. So in other words, when I started the project, the system added for me these meta tags here, not the description one, I added that. But it added our character set, our UTF-8, meaning again we're using Unicode. It added this, which from what I've read at least on line 29 is a hack that pretty much says, hey, if you're using Internet Explorer, treat this as though you've got Edge. And this is the viewport that we put in that basically that you use so that you're able to go in and responsively have responsive website design. So we've talked about this stuff before. We did look, and I kind of butchered it a little bit, but we did look at some video tag stuff and some audio tag stuff. So if you're still a little concerned or confused or both about that, you can go back and take a look at the HTML review. I don't remember which one it was at, probably towards the end more. Here's an example of embedding a video. So we did something very similar to this. We may not have used the exact syntax, but it should have been pretty close. There's an audio. And then we get into CSS. Some of the stuff that you can do with CSS. Now, is this important? You should have at least a fundamental understanding of colors. You should understand the box model and understand that you've got your content. And surrounding your content is your padding. Surrounding your padding is your border. Surrounding your border is your margin. All right? You should know that the way that we set up padding and margin, basically with either full margin or margin left and or margin right and or margin bottom, so margin top and or margin right and or margin bottom and or margin left, is the same thing as setting it up for padding. In other words, padding top, padding right, padding bottom, and padding left. Whereas margin is usually done so you can set up the distance between different elements on a page. Padding is designed to give you more room within the element itself on the page. All right. We talked about the use of colors, and I showed you at least 6 different ways of using colors. That is the natural colors themselves, in other words, the keywords. And then we looked at RGB, red, green, blue, RGBA, which is red, green, blue, alpha. Then we looked at using the hex colors, and we looked at hue, saturation, and light, HSL, and hue, saturation, and light with alpha as well. All right, we talked about working with lists. You saw examples of ordered lists, unordered lists, and definition lists. And I even mentioned to you that definition lists, at least as far as I can tell, aren't used nearly as much as ordered lists and unordered lists. You should know by now the difference between those, and I gave you an example back in here. So we had an unordered list where we had our list of ingredients for our chocolate chip cookies where order doesn't matter. All right, that was the UL or unordered list. Then we had our steps for actually cooking or creating and baking our cookies. There the order does matter, so we used an ordered list. All right, we went through a form. We styled the form. I showed you a lot of the different controls on there. We looked at borders, and you've looked a little bit at text shadows. All right, we got in and we talked about floats, and I showed you some examples of floating an image or having the text float around an image on the left or on the right, okay, and how to clear floats. Personally, as he says, I don't think you really need to learn floats now. I don't really agree with that, and the reason for that is if you are going to be working on a website where you are going to be doing work maintaining the site, they may have floats in there. And a lot of times people, because floats have been pretty much been replaced by Flexbox and by CSS Grid, but I remember years ago when I had my first programming job, all right, I was given some code that didn't work and I was told to fix it. It was a few hundred lines of code. Well, I sat down with a manual because I didn't even really know the language, but I got it to work. And I noticed that when I ran it, it literally had about 100 warnings. There were no errors, but it had 100 warnings. And I asked my boss, should I fix the warnings? And he said, well, you've got the errors out, right? And I said, yeah. He said, when you run it, does it work? And I said, yeah. Then he said, leave it alone. All right. So the reason I'm telling you that is at times, at least, you might have floats in an existing website, and you may or may not have the ability to change that into Flexbox and or Grid. All right. So Mr. Traversy is a big proponent of Flexbox. As he says here, it's one of the best things to come to CSS. And here's one time where I would strongly recommend that if you're still, whether you go through, let's say, hey, I don't want to go through this. You told us to go through this West Boss CSS Grid and this West Boss Flexbox tutorial. He's even got another free one where you build 30 different JavaScript projects in 30 days. All right, again, I've asked you to check the first 2 out, really, if you can, to check out all 3. But if you can't, don't have the time, I'm going to come in here and I'm going to type in Brad Traversy Flexbox Crash Course. All right, and you'll notice that when I do that, there's his Flexbox Crash Course 2022. Again, it's not short. All right. It's 46 minutes and 54 seconds, so almost 50 minutes. He's got another one for CSS Grid. All right. Then he builds a responsive website in a 2-hour thing where he uses Grid and Flexbox. Again, a lot of this depends how much do you want to learn this stuff. Not only that, what do you want to do? If you want to be especially a front-end web developer, if that's one of your goals, you want to become more than proficient in Flexbox and Grid. You want to be a master as much as you can master it. All right, enough sermonizing. So you always use the display flex when you're doing this. All right, and remember that when you use Flexbox, we talked about this before. All right, Flexbox is designed for you to be able to work with a row or with a column, but not with both. If you want to work with both at once, you use CSS Grid. And again, he's got his Flexbox crash course. I'm probably going to end up watching that again before the semester starts. All right. CSS Grid, as it says, was released a little bit after Flexbox, whereas Flexbox is one-dimensional, again, either rows or columns. All right. Grid is two-dimensional, so it allows you to work with columns and rows at the same time. All right. You display Grid as opposed to display Flexbox. And as he says, I would suggest learning both because they can be useful in different ways. Personally, he likes to use grids for the overall layout and then Flexbox for what goes on there. All right. So again, these are not competing foes. They can very much work together. All right. Let's see where I am here. All right. I'm doing fine. Media queries and responsive design. I showed you one of the things that I showed you in a very recent video. Let's see if I still got that. Probably not up on the screen. I don't. But if I come up here, again, this is something that I took from Mr. Traversy. I've changed it around. Okay. But, oh, where is it? I thought that let's see. Well, that is there. So let's see. Well, that isn't the one, but somewhere in here, in my mess, media queries, there we go. That was this one. So it came up and I changed it, put the size in there so that you could see that as we shrink our screen size and we get to a certain size, the color changes. And so that's a wide screen. That's a normal screen. That's a tablet view. And that's a smartphone view. All right. So media queries, the idea behind a media query, here's some examples, but the idea behind a media query is that you want your site to look good regardless of whether you're looking at it on a phone or whether you're looking at it on a tablet or a laptop or a desktop or something else. So with responsive design, in an ideal world, if you're building a brand new website, you should be thinking mobile first, which means you build for the smallest device first and then build your way out. It's usually harder to do it that way, but in the end, you end up with a better site. All right. It says, I prefer to build desktop first unless I expect more traffic from mobile users. That's a good point. Many developers are taking a mobile-first approach. Even frameworks like Tailwind and Bootstrap are mobile-first frameworks. Now, this is interesting. Progressive enhancement and graceful degradation. We used to talk a lot about this, all right? Before I came to Rankin, I taught at a technical college in Wisconsin. for almost 25 years. And I had a class that was similar to the AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies class. And in that class, we would talk quite a bit about progressive enhancement and graceful degradation. All right. So with progressive enhancement, it says you start with a simple layout. So in other words, you assume the user has just bare bones as far as what they have available to be used. Okay? And then you say, well, if you also have this, then you add something else. If you have this, you add something else. Graceful degradation is the opposite. You start by thinking the user has everything, and then you peel away or take away what you need based on what they don't have. And Mr. Traversy says here he prefers to use graceful degradation when working on layouts. All right. One of the last things I did in the CSS thing for Mr. Copes was we talked about animations and transitions. All right, it says once you build a fairly decent looking website and understand the fundamentals of HTML and CSS, you're ready to move on to learning something else. That does not mean you're 100% done learning HTML and CSS. It says you learn more as you complete more projects. It's like anything else. I have been trying for the last year, pretty much, I've been taking guitar lessons. Not to be funny and not to be dirty, but I pretty much suck. I've had lessons averaging 1 to 2 a week, and I've gotten better, but I'm still not that good. I try to practice an hour a day. Do I succeed with that? Usually I take 1 day a week off, and I try to average 45 minutes to an hour a day. But again, as it says, you get better at design. You get better at anything as you progress or as you practice your way through it. All right, it says PSD, and that's like a Photoshop document, I believe. And what that is you get a picture that somebody has created that a website should look like, and then you hire somebody to create it for you. And there's a lot of work to be done in sites like that. That's what a lot of freelancers do. They'll get sent a picture, and somebody will say, build this, and that's their job. All right, he talks in here a little bit about SAS. SAS, and I don't think it stands for anything. I could be wrong, but I don't think it does. It's a CSS preprocessor. The thing is, it allows you to kind of supercharge CSS, and you can actually create your own variables in there. Do a certain amount of work with functions, modules, and operators. I'm not going to go into SAS at all. I'm not a SAS master. I haven't done very much with SAS, but the idea is you can go in and do things like this, where you create variables, and then you can basically grab those variables, pluck them out of where they are, and add them to anything that you need to add them to in your actual document. All right. It says you can also use something that's called mix-ins, where it lets you take groups of CSS declarations. So you almost use this as though it's a function. So you create the mix-in, and then you can include it and add it. Okay. You can also share a set of CSS properties with one another using inheritance. Okay. Some stuff is inherited by default. Other things you have to say you want inherited. All right. He has a SAS crash course. Should you watch it if you're interested? All right. Talking a little bit about some CSS frameworks. Tell you what, again, I'm at 24 minutes, and we're going to talk in here about Bootstrap, and we're going to talk about Tailwind. I don't know how long that's going to take, so I'm going to pick it up on page 65 when I come back with the next lecture.